It's a great honour and great delight to welcome Michael Dyson this afternoon. I think he's known to everybody in this audience. He's an activist, an academic, a preacher, a lecturer, and a larger-than-life person. So delighted to have him here this afternoon to talk about this issue of popular religion and Black American culture. He's the author of 17 books and has written widely on religion, politics, major figures in American political and cultural life. I felt particularly flattered since he said he'd read one of my books when he was a graduate, which says more about my age than the quality of the book, I think. In any case, the topic of his talk today is God Complex, Complex Gods, or God's Complex, J.Z. Poor Black Youth, and Making the Struggle Divine. So thank you very much, Michael.
All right, thank you. Well, it is a great honor for me to be here. I did read Professor Turner's work in graduate school in New Jersey, and it was some of the best stuff that I read as a graduate student, so I was really honored to be invited to this august panel. We were kicked off brilliantly with Joseph Soret's powerful meditation this morning, and the spirit and the arts, and did a great job. He had all the PowerPoint presentations down with the Aretha Franklin samples. You know, reminds me of there's a great preacher who used to preach here in New York, in Queens, William Augustus Jones. And he had what they said about Carlisle Marney was true of him as well. He said he had a voice like God's, only deeper. And he said that, preachers who could sing, even when they failed on their preaching, they could, rim it on in or use their spare, but that the preachers who didn't have the ability to sing, when they fell flat, they just had to rim it on in and make it without the spare. So, as a professor, if you got a PowerPoint, even if you're flunking, you at least got some good stuff, bells and whistles to point to, though his was both engaging intellectually as well as stimulating visually. I'm looking forward to my dear friend, Professor Marla Frederick's presentation later on, given the important work she does in black religion and media and publicity and the global context. It's also good to see Professor Aubrey Hendricks here. I'm actually going to use some of Aubrey Hendricks' work and make reference to it today in my little talk. But as you know, he's a very gifted linguist and religionist, and is Professor Soret's colleague at Columbia and at New York Theological Seminary, and does great work on biblical studies and the analysis of texts and hermeneutics. So shout Professor Aubrey Hendricks out. She'll hold up, just hold up your hand, let them know who you are. So today, I want to chat a bit at Professor Turner's invitation about God Complex, Complex Gods, or God's Complex. I like how he said it, JZ. Like that. That European ring. I like that. Poor Black Youth and Making the Struggle Divine. And I think the powerful argument that, or at least line of thinking that Professor Soret and his wonderful interlocutor, what is your full name though, man?
Adrian Lotson.
All right, Adrian Lotson, we're having this morning about the nature of the popular and thinking about popular in all manners of all forms and manners, popular as demographically driven, popular as a racial or class construct, popular as in a folk element or a product of or element against modernity. But I chose to talk a bit about the rapper Jay-Z because I think he brings into sharp and hopefully luminous focus our thinking about popular religion, religion of the popular, and religion in a popular vein, and complicating static and rigid conceptions of both religion and the popular, and to introduce a kind of symbiotic syntax of and grammar within the popular and religion, to try to raise questions about either one of them, because once we think we know what they are, they're constantly being challenged by the evolution and expansion of ideas that circulate around the boundaries of and constitute the borders, in one sense, of notions of religion and popular and, of course, American culture. So I called it God complex, complex gods, or gods complex, because to begin with, Jay-Z's name itself, Jehovah, Jehovah, Hova, Hov, and any other permutation of this neologism, this new term he generated to try to signify his God-like status. God of the microphone, small g, a commanding presence as an MC, also initially establishes a direct link between the manipulation of rhetoric and the assertion of religious legitimacy. So that within black popular religion, however we come to construe that, one of the mainstays of and defining characteristics within that is a notion of the engagement with the rhetorical, how rhetorics operate, how they're constituted, whether you're reading Kenneth Burke or whether you're reading Ralph Ellison, the way in which rhetoric becomes a means by which the articulation of religious identities is rooted and deeply entrenched in oratorical performances and rhetorical assertions. And those oratorical performances and rhetorical assertions, of course, have a deep and profound lineage, some of which Professor Soret, referred to in terms of the chanted sermon. Think about Albert Rabato's brilliant essay on the chanted sermon. Think about, or what was known within the culture as the hoop. The chanted sermon was called the hoop. The hoop itself is almost like an act of onomatopoeia, so that the very articulation of the term itself conjures the phenomenon after which it aims to explore and to illuminate. And so the sermon itself, the performance of oratory, links Jay-Z to black preaching traditions. And those black preaching traditions are critical. I was very interested in the conversation this morning about the relationship between prosperity gospel preachers and other traditions of black rhetoric. Because when you think about it, black sacred rhetoric is still relatively invisible to the dominant culture. The varieties of black rhetorical performance are still obscured and masked in the dominant culture. We hear Jesse Jackson, William Gray, Martin Luther King Jr., and we're hearing extraordinary exponents of black rhetoric, but that begins barely to touch the tip of the iceberg, and certainly to reveal it. Because for every Martin Luther King Jr. and Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, there is a Caesar Clark in terms of the rhetorical ingenuity of the chanted sermon, or a Gardner Calvin Taylor, one of the magisterial prophets of the American pulpit, a colossus bestriding, if you will, black American rhetorical performance. And very different kinds of rhetorical performances, even within that tremendously fecund and fertile black rhetorical tradition. Gardner Taylor was deeply steeped in traditional and highly nuanced European canonical texts within the so-called mainstream white pulpit, and not just mainstream white pulpit, but mainstream white European pulpit. So that you would hear him saying, in P.T. Forsyth, in his 1907 Beecher lecture, says, God saves us not by flattering us, but by opposing us. And I do no justice here. You have to hear his voice. God saves us not by flattering us, but by opposing us. And then you have Caesar Clarke, right? You better not front the Lord around. I don't have a PowerPoint. I wish I did, like Professor Sawyer, you know. Because if you're trying to find the Lord around the winds, right? Guttural articulation, internal expression, right? So that the chanted sermon and the sermon that is highly disciplined by allusion to European canonical texts constitutes a legitimate diversity, among many other things, within black oratorical and rhetorical performances. So Jay-Z is linked to that. So people see the difference between a Nas, whose voice is perhaps resonating in his throat, or Tupac, who's speaking from his gut, or Biggie, who's swinging like a jazz musician in a different fashion. The difference between Ella Fitzgerald, articulating at once a nasal tonality, and Sarah Vaughan, who is amplifying sound nearly through her neck. The difference between Cannonball Adderley or John Coltrane on the saxophone. Those differences register literally and signify phonically and sonically. And so black preaching traditions have legitimately been compared to those oratorical performances, or at least those registers of aesthetic appreciation and aspiration in different fields of pursuit. And so when we think about Nas versus Jay-Z versus Tupac versus Lauryn Hill, or Gardner Taylor versus Caesar Clarke versus Freddie Haynes versus Lance Watson versus Carolyn Knight versus Prathia Hall, all names that we should be familiar with to be sure. When we think about black rhetoric, then, the very notion of Jehovah, Jay-Z, the oratorical performance, the rhetor, the Burkean signifier within the complicated configuration of identities that are mediated through text, textuality, intertextuality, post-textuality in a certain way, right? Because it begins to challenge the construction of a solidified, stable set of signifiers that go under and are subsumed under the rubric of the text to begin with. They're breaking out even as they constitute. It's an interesting move. So when I think about Jay-Z, Jehovah, Hova, God, MC, the self-conscious manipulation of a rhetorical tradition of identifying with God, transcendence, is one thing. This is where Jay-Z then begins to shatter the boundaries of this identification, because ministers who claim to have divine authority by their identification with God, Jay-Z ups the ante and says, I'm gonna raise you one, I am God. Rhetorically. Metaphorically. We'll get into later on why people think he's sacrilegious. So when I think about the name itself, the names themselves that simultaneously signify upon a transcendence to which Jay-Z alludes, and the mediation of that divine experience. You're now about to witness, he says in one song, or he talks about thinking about hip-hop without the God MC, and that he's the savior of hip-hop. He consciously manipulates this rhetoric. He talks about God constantly, the relentless association of himself with God, thus deriving some benefit from and legitimacy within this context of divine grammars, but also to assert something powerful and unique that he begins to both assert a tradition and shatter it at once. And so the association of Jay-Z with black rhetorical forms, most closely and intimately linked to black preaching, also begins to ask us to think more deeply about the nature of the divine and transcendence and how it's mediated through moments of speech. We think about black rhetorical performances for the history of African American pilgrimages here from slavery on down, and what the function of the black preacher was to stimulate liturgical consciousness, to reinforce the stability of worship experiences as contexts of divine contact, as a way to resist white supremacist discourse in a major dominant culture that refused to cede the legitimacy and authority of black humanity, and to simultaneously put forth an intellectual argument which was the bulwark against the oppressions to which people were subject. And as substitute for both God, in terms of the ministerial office, and the masses, the people, literally the vox populi, a different take on popular, vox popular, vox populi, the articulation of a consistent creative community that is mediated through a rhetorical act and gesture. That being the case, the rhetorical performance then signifies a divine moment of interaction with human vulnerability, but then transposes that vulnerability and puts it back on the very God being seen. That's the space of theodicy. Asking the question if God intends good stuff, why does bad stuff happen? We'll talk about that in a minute. But the rhetorical force and form are merged, fused, mingled, creatively conflicted, and at the end of the day, operate within a tradition of expression that either ministers or MCs have given enlivened expression to. So just the name Jehovah, God MC, Hova, the self-conscious manipulation of that. And when we juxtapose that, however, to the fact that Jay-Z says, if you read his book, Decoded, that, and he says it in some songs, I'm not a Christian, but I listen to the people who deal with different religions, and I derive the wisdom from them. You read Decoded and hear him saying that, but then you read some of his lyrics, where he says, I'm not God, but I work goddamn hard, right? If you listen to some of his early stuff, The Evils, where he's dealing with the presence of dark forces, taking all the way up from his first album, Reasonable Doubt, to his first retirement album, which was the Black Album, where he's talking about Lucifer, praying for this person because he's got those dark forces in him. So Jay-Z is constantly conscious of and engaged with notions of the shadow self, not in the Jungian sense, but also in the kind of theological sense where the notion of darkness is the overcast of a presence, a singular existential presence of demonic fury and intensity. So constantly dealing with religion, Jehovah, conscious of religion, and in some cases spirituality, but refusing finally to hunker down in one. Not the smorgasbord approach, not the cafeteria approach, perhaps, as I'll argue in a bit, a more eclectic approach. But when you juxtapose Decoded, his openness to different religions and varieties of thinking, versus what he said in some of his lyrics, where he's engaging a notion of both God different from, and yet identified with vulnerable people, notions of incarnation, notions of transcendence, somehow being hijacked by earthly purposes, but also for Jay-Z, when I look at his lyrical content and outpouring, looking at the way in which the very notion of the divine has to be deconstructed relentlessly. So when I look at his body of work, I look at the complicated ways in which he signifies on religious tradition. Then we begin to think about, as I began with, religion and popular. If ligare, to bind together, religion, religio. And then to think about the popular, how we constitute it, Professor Soret, And his wonderful interlocutor began to kind of demystify some of the elements, began to specify, with interesting clarity what it might mean to talk about popular, whether it was popular because it was associated with certain folk traditions, which were remnants of an engagement with identity, and the way in which imagination might mediate that. Was it class-based? Was it race-based? Was it popular in the sense that it appealed to the masses? Was it popular in the sense that it was a folk element, the product of a certain genealogy of modernity and a contest with the forces of destabilization that came in modernity? And if that was true of modernity, what's true of post-modernity? So when we talk about what's popular, that's a complicated phrase. Are we talking about the Kim Kardashian version of popular that lasts a few days and then moves into different realities like marriage, or like the concentration on, how media are deployed for purposes of engaging identity, or at least reestablishing the protocols of narcissism? Popular in the sense of the concretization of a belief about how that which is ineffable and impenetrable can be brought to bear in very classically clear fashion. The stuff that we thought was transcendent and beyond now becomes available to us because we can think about it. We begin to delimit the borders of meaning and purpose, and therefore it becomes much clearer what we're aiming at. That sense of popular, because it's been able to be consumed by more people than a few of the esoteric. Or do we talk about popular in terms of the class-based stuff where folk religion signifies in a certain way? Now that has racial and certainly class and perhaps even gender consequences to which we should pay attention. So when I think about, even in an abbreviated genealogy, a notion of religion as binding something together, the institutionalization of inspiration, the desire for spirituality to have some grounding, and then on the other hand, for the popular to have its multiple significations, then you got to figure out, when we talk about popular religion, how exactly what Jay-Z does fits into it. Well, I would argue that he's trying to, or at least we can use him to, whether he's trying to or not is up to us to think about and think through, but certainly he's challenging a very narrow conception of what might be authentically religious. Secondly, I think he's raising questions about the function of a certain branch of theology, theodicy in particular, and the way in which it functions in both African American and more broadly in American life. And then thirdly, the radical identification with a transcendent deity, God become human, is the reassertion of an incarnational ethic that he dares appropriate for communities which have been rendered vulnerable economically, politically, and racially. And so the offense, Paul Tillich talked about shattering the apos seges, the divine silence of God, right? In Jesus. Well, Jay-Z wants to shatter that silence. That's why he has in one of his songs, I'm from the place where the churches are the flakiest. Niggas been praying to God so long they're atheists. Can't hear, can't feel a connection to the divine, don't know where the voice of God is located, so locate it in your voice. The locus classicus of divinity becomes the very voice that is seeking the divine inspiration that ultimately will be supplied by one's own work. That's why Jay-Z's work ethic is a profound meditation on not only a Weberian conception of the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, and my God, how does Weber become any more materialized than in Hova? That's on a side note. We could pursue that later, So I'm going to suggest a few things and then open it up for question and answer and dialogue. The ways in which I think Jay-Z operates here, does he have, to answer my own title, C. Van Woodward did say a title is a contract between an audience and an author. So the God complex, a lot of young people now think that Jay-Z thinks he's God. I was discussing with my colleagues some interesting responses of young people thinking that Jay-Z and Kanye are devil worshipers, and they tripped out, they're part of the Illuminati. I said, wow, that's just pretty fascinating. Who knew that a guy from Marcy was the Illuminati? That might be a divine trick, right? You remember how Jay-Z says, I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman, so let me handle my business damn. So he might say, I'm not Illuminati, I'm illuminating. Okay, that's just... I'm just trying to test my lyrics out, see how they gonna flow. I might try that, I might not try that. I will have to adjust. So, God complex, the obsession with, the identification with the transcendent, that is not simply a God complex. That kind of obsession is not the desire to, or a hankering for the divine to become human. That is the original sin, to believe that the human is the divine. And so this is the charge that has been leveled against Jay-Z and others, but many times him. I think it's from a not a Derridian profound misreading that can have powerful consequences that are edifying. I think it's a profoundly flat reading of the landscape of Black American culture. Because in one sense, as my younger colleague Salome Shatila talks about it, that Illuminati stuff among Black people, it ain't new, right? It's just that the objects of it are new. Because Black folk been talking about Illuminati for a long time, but it's been white folk. Because white folk had the ends, the money, the dough, the bread, the capital. Now that Black folk have emerged and get up on top. Remember Jay-Z in the Watch the Throne says, Domino, the higher I go, you know, what does he say? He says, the less people I see, right? The less people who are Black, right? What up, Will? What up, O? You know, that's cool, but we're going to need 1 million more. Fewer Black people, the higher I get. So now the suspicion of arrival, the suspicion of success, in scare quotes, the suspicion of creative outlets, granted people who had heretofore been circumscribed in vicious fashion, the skepticism and suspicion gets concentrated on. Now the conspiracy theory gets turned against other Black people. So it's the conflation of paranoia and conspiracy theory with the new narrative of Black exceptionalism. That's why Obama is considered part of this Illuminati, and Jay-Z considered part of the Illuminati. You got to have a certain kind of income to be Illuminati. It's not for poor people, right? Need not apply, literally, right? People without money are weird. People with money are eccentric. Illuminati is a political and, in one sense, a sociological judgment about the forces of capital and the ways in which capital has converged with politics to create unhappy alliances between powers, powers over which the masses feel they have little control. And so I would argue in part that the resistance to Jay-Z as an Illuminati is the grassroots theodicy, a grassroots attempt to try to figure out the gap. Is when we talk about theodicy, the disjuncture between destiny and merit, right, in the Weberian sense, what you think you deserve and what you end up getting. And the gap between that measures that theodical reality. Well, partly the Illuminati discourse is a rhetoric of criticism dressed up as a religiously identified assertion that also has profound sociological consequences. So the God complex, thinking you God, the sense of the deification of the temporary. Remember, Herskovitz talked about the deification of accident as a signature African modality. Well, the deification of the temporary is nothing more than, or nothing less than, a kind of desire to be God, God's self. Hubris as a moment of blasphemy. And so Jay-Z is read often by those who are very critical of him as trying to be God in the most inappropriate fashion possible. And I said, well, that's one thing in terms of the God complex, but he's asserting complex gods. He wants to say, yep, there is no question that human beings who are vulnerable have the potential to rise above their circumstances. Recognize your greatness in many ways and in many lyrics. Recognize the greatness of who we are, recognize the greatness of what we do, recognize the value and worth and significance of the struggles in which you engage. So that you are complex gods, complex human beings who are centers of moral gravity around which orbits meaning and significance that you are able to, in one sense, if not control, at least generate the meaning for, generate the significance for, and generate as a way of arguing against the dehumanizing impulses of the broader culture and society. Well, between the God complex and the complex gods is this God's complex. This, to me, is the socio-spiritual, the kind of urban geopolitics of the black poor. And we heard earlier arguments about the popular, one of which is that it get associated with poor black people. These are legacies and lineages of authenticity. Who's real? Black poor, real. Within hip hop, who's real? Black poor, real and authentic. The hood, the urban merchant, the urban Urshan, the citizen of the destabilized post-industrial urban cultures where enclaves of civic terror like slums and ghettos proliferate. The geopolitics of urban misery constitute a ground for urban theodicy. And so God's complex here, I'm talking about the complex, the compound, the project, the hood. The geopolitics of urban theodicy, God's complex. The bounded realities that human beings acknowledge and reinforce in the face of tremendous devastation. And so what I'm aiming at here then is that for me, Jay-Z has been constantly trying, as Professor Aubrey Hendricks talks about it, to make the needs of the people divine. It ain't all people, it's specific people. People who are poor, people who are mostly black and brown, people whose backs are against the wall economically, people who have been devastated by not only a downturn in the economy, but a permanent trend that would hemorrhage jobs and people from core economic processes in our cities. And so it's a peculiar and particular phenomenon that I think Jay-Z is speaking to and representing. And for him, those communities become the site of serious engagement with forces of oppression and the assertion of counter-narratives of meaning and, ironically, of hope and destiny. So for the little time I have left then, I want to talk about how he speaks about, I think, or engaged with these ideas and trying to make the struggle of the people divine, to twist it, to shape it, to reverse it. The last shall be first, the first shall be last. Except in one sense, he's got what C.H. Dowd would call a realized eschatology. It ain't just the end stuff. It ain't just the end time stuff. It's being realized in his own success. His own success is realized eschatology. The telos goal and purpose of history has been redefined, and some would say reified, in the very means of his success, which is why, even on the Watch the Throne, all that luxury rap, as Kanye calls it, is aspirational. Now, it doesn't mean it doesn't have deep and profound indexes of and traces of the most mortifying materialism, and not in the grip of the vicious economic processes which have damaged the communities which are the site of this urban theodicy, but it is a down payment against the meaningfulness that can be extracted from that devastation. So when I think about Jay-Z putting forth his most important religious concept to me, is not about a narcissistic preoccupation with the divine or a legitimate understanding that the divine intersects with the human. I mean, think about it. Even William R. Jones, William Augustus Jones, I quoted him, his cousin, the great theologian, right, or religious thinker, I should say, said that he believed in humanocentric theism, that we have to posit the legitimacy of the human as the site of the divine. Because in that sense, we take away any responsibility by asking the question of theodicy, and we got to start asking the question of anthropodicy. What we doing? Not if, why the plane broke, God, you messed up and slipped up and didn't watch over us. No, why did the plane makers not do their job right? So that the historically contingent conceptions of responsibility and accountability are refracted through the prism of our own making and our own, therefore, control. So that's why on the outside it looks like a up from slavery, do it for yourself, bootstrap capitalism of Booker T. Washington, but something else, I would argue, is going on at the same time. So a couple things I want to talk about before I end. So for me, Jay-Z's religious thinking is embedded rather than terrestrial. Right? It's definitely deeply inscribed in the local flora and fauna, the local sites. We talk about local knowledge, right? The local knowledge of Marcy projects, of the slum, God's complex. This is the specific site for the emergence of religious narratives that deify the folk who have been devastated. It's not merely compensatory, though it's certainly that. It's not merely a kind of revenge against those who have been the vicious mediators of that dislocation and displacement, though in part that. It is the assertion of the positive value of the lives that have been shaped in the midst of those circumstances. So embedded rather than terrestrial, in the sense that the philosophical origin and the theological intent is not simply to locate God in a heaven or hell beyond where we are, but to talk about the deeply entrenched and embedded conceptions of God on earth, heaven on earth, and the realities that we confront right here where we are. It's a deeply and profoundly embedded, we could say incarnated, but embedded in the sense that it comes from the earth and the terrain of the geopolitical struggles waged in slums and ghettos. Secondly, I would argue it's implicit rather than explicit as well. So it ain't no great theological system going on here. Poor black youth who are the object of his adoration, his hymn to the universe, if we can borrow Desjardins, his making their struggle divine. It's interesting because it's implicit rather than explicit. And one of the great tensions between the so-called civil rights generation and this so-called, and there are multiple generations now, hip-hop generation, is the fact that we can't track the politics, you know? Yeah, we can read Robin Kelly and before him James Scott and try to figure out these infra-politics, and the stuff is, you know, can't be determined and it's not traditional politics, but there's no patience for that among black and Latino, and for that matter, even poor white youth. right? There's just not much tolerance and patience for understanding that there are different ways in which these politics get construed because there are different circumstances under which these politics have emerged. A lot of old people say, well, we don't see it, we don't get it. Where's the damn politics? Where are you? You know, and whatever, and by extension, where are the religious beliefs? So I think that they're more implicit than explicit because they're deeply embedded and inscribed in the narratives Jay-Z puts forth that value the lives of poor black people, that talk about their suffering, that narrate it. Now all my teachers couldn't reach me, and my mama couldn't beat me hard enough to match the pain of my pop not seeing me. So, with that disdain in my membrane, got on my pimp game, fuck the world, my defense came. God forgive me for my brash delivery, but I remember vividly what these streets did to me. Imagine me allowing them to nitpick at me, portray me like a pickaninny. That's a lot of interesting imagery. The pickaninny, father absence. I'm not arguing that this is a Talcott Parsons-like sociological analysis of, or even for that matter, a William Jewis Wilson-like analysis of the ghetto poor, but dadgummit, it ain't got to be that to be important and significant and useful and interesting. It is putting forth an argument about the relationship between father absence and a subsequent denial, a subsequent surrender of the authority of traditional institutions in the lives of these young people, and a surrender of the concomitant meaningfulness that is derived from an identification with institutions which served others but which failed these young black people. And so these institutions mediated through both the home, mama couldn't beat me, or the school, and teachers couldn't reach me. Jay-Z doesn't graduate from high school, Nas drops out in 8th grade. Who's wrong? These kids are the institutions because they turn out to be geniuses. And if they turn out to be that smart, who's wrong, right? The argument here is that there are enough of these young geniuses, and they are merely representative of them, the priests of an order that has been marginalized. Well, I mean, maybe there's something to be said for the difference between schooling and education. And maybe they have something to say about that. The point simply is that inherent in, implicit, are varieties of thinking, logics, rhetorics that are mobilized within the context of that community that allow us at least to, I think, determine and detect and discern some serious and significant political thinking going on. I happened to go to the Jay-Z concert last night at the Verizon Center. And during Made in America, you know, you got the Martin Luther King Jr. face up there, and it's not just Martin Luther King Jr., it's not Martin Luther King Jr., I Have a Dream, it's Martin Luther King Jr. last speech. That's different, right? The last speech, I may not get there with you. And if you read that whole speech, I mean, that's a hip-hop performance. That's King's greatest hip-hop performance in that sense. You're at the crib, you know, you don't want to go to the meeting that night because people tried to, you know, portray it as King was depressed. He was. It was raining cats and dogs. It was. He didn't like small audiences either. Right? That's the human part. We don't want to, you know. He didn't want about 5 people looking at him. If I'm gonna speak, let me at least have 1,000. Now he ain't said that way, and we know King is a humble man. But we'll dog Jesse and Al Sharpton. We'll dog Jesse and Al Sharpton. But if King doesn't want to show up because there ain't enough people there, we're going to figure it out. We're going to finesse it. It's the same deal, dog. He's depressed deeply and profoundly, right? I mean, look at the parallels that are very uncomfortable in terms of King and that so-called degraded hip-hop generation. Dependence upon certain drugs to make it through in the hip-hop generation. King increasingly reliant upon, by order of his doctor right here up the street in New York, Dr. Logan, of both antidepressants and alcohol. And it's not working. And King goes to the hotel that night under the threat of death. and is tired. And Ralph Abernathy gets to the Mason Temple and said, Doc, we can't, this is your audience. They've shown up. It's a couple thousand people out here. He gets dressed, gets up, had that rough skin, depilatory, shaves, gets over, takes a cab, and delivers arguably the greatest speech of his life. Arguably. He takes a tour of history in a brilliant thought scenario and talking about the great spots in history, Abraham Lincoln, Aristophanes, on and on and on. And he said, if God allows me to live a few years in the 20th century, I will be satisfied. And he said, America, all I'm asking is that you be true to what you said on paper. He talked about young people digging the wells deep of democracy. Then he imagined he said that he had been written a letter by a young white girl. He said it shouldn't make a difference, but she was a young white girl from White Plains, New York. When I got stabbed, he said, in Harlem. A whole book has been written about the day Harlem almost killed Dr. King. And Isola Ware Curry, a, quote, demented black woman, almost ended King's career before it got started. I mean, Isaac and Abraham becoming the inadvertent victim, an unwitting object of death at the hands of one's fathers. So King said that he got the letter. He didn't remember the letter from the governor or the mayor or the president, but he remembered this little white girl who wrote him and said, Dear Dr. King, I read in the paper that had you sneezed, that you would have drowned in your own blood and died. I'm just here to tell you, I'm so glad you didn't sneeze. And King played off of that like a brilliant preacher will. Said, I don't believe y'all hear me. No, he didn't say that, but amen lights, right? Black people know how to beg against silence as a down payment on an affirmation. So King uses this story like any great storyteller, any great artist, any great orator, any great rhetorician, any great rapper, weaves it into his story, and then ends by saying, I don't know what will happen now, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory, and turns on his heel and falls into the arms of Jesse Jackson and Ralph Abernathy, passing the baton without understanding it. A rhetorical performance that not only signifies the improvisational element of jazz and certain elements of the blues, but also anticipating certain rhetorical gestures that have been amplified within hip hop. And so, implicit in what happens, that last speech facing death, consequences of one's own mortality, the parallels between what King is doing there and what happens in other communities where young people like Jay-Z, Nas, Scarface, deeply depressed, depressive, Tupac, depressive. So my argument about this sociological analysis that's implicit, it is implicit. It may not be as explicit as what we expected and desired and received from Dr. King. And already Professor Soret talked about the danger of the reductio ad absurdum of making Dr. King the synecdoche, really the representative of all religious value within Black America to begin with. Chris Rocks signifies on that. He said the answer to everything in Black history on the test, Dr. King. Who's Christmas at? Dr. King. Who's the first person to die in the Civil War? Dr. King. So, implicit versus explicit, and yet those politics are powerful. Robin Kelly makes an argument about those infra-politics of James Scott. Everyday forms of resistance, people began to assert the legitimacy of their struggle as the means of warehousing something more significant. In this case, I would argue the divine. Not only that, it's situational versus being apodictic. You know, it's not just speaking ex cathedra from the chair. This is the end all and be all. There's constant and relentless adjustment, revision, hermeneutical play, interpretive warfare going on in Jay-Z and in hip-hop more broadly, but situational in the sense that authority hinges upon arguments to be made within the context of the suffering that exists. Now, that's a lesson that a lot of other religious people might want to pay attention to. Now, I know it's about this big argument between relativism on the one hand and stuff is going all out of control versus the kind of stability of tradition and truth that are mediated. But what's interesting here is that the situational character of the knowledge that's produced and the suffering that is alluded to is important because you got to make arguments that make sense within the context of the suffering you're enduring. That's a heck of an argument there. I think I see the evidence for it in Jay-Z. But so for me, situational in the sense of not just situational ethics, right? But also situational in the sense that it pays attention to what the religion, what the biblical scholars call the sitzim labum, the life circumstances and situation that people have to confront, and that these rhetors and these orators, these rappers, these MCs allude to. So situational in the sense that the situations, the life circumstances, and we talk about black preaching, Manuel Scott, a great situational life preacher, Charles Gilchrist Adams, Jeremiah Wright. I guess it ain't even popular to bring up Dr. Wright's name because of his relationship to Obama. Dr. Hendricks wrote a brilliant essay on Jeremiah Wright. I mean, if you love Obama, you got to love Jeremiah Wright because Jeremiah Wright brought Obama to Jesus, right? Just by that logic. Because if you love Obama, you got to love Jeremiah Wright. Goddamn right. Okay, I guess that one didn't. Y'all get it? Goddamn. Oh, come on, man. Just help me out. Just help me out. Just help me out. I'm not saying goddamn right. I'm trying to signify. That's not my obscene or even profane in a Rudolph Otto moment. So what's interesting is that Jeremiah Wright and Manuel Scott and Charles Gilchrist Adams or Jim Forbes or Prathia Hall in particular, Bishop Hunter in Philadelphia, a brilliant woman preaching there. So these situations that are being evoked in the context of the suffering become the moments of revelation. But it's situational in the sense that the truth has to be argued for. Remember, Richard Rorty had all that argument in 1979 that, we have these competing claims about what's true in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, and he had said all that stuff about, Descartes and Cartesian epistemology being framed by a glassy essence, which was a mirror, because the analogy of the mirror became the means by which knowledge was mediated, arguing against the Kantian Dingon Zitch in a certain way, so that the Cartesian epistemology was being framed in the context of an analogy that was rooted in sight, the optics. But then he said, look, we got to figure out something different. That philosophy can no longer be the queen science, if you will, adjudicating competing claims about what's true. You got to make arguments based upon the circumstances and situations of your own given finite context. So that the a priori, Kantian a priori, had to be acknowledged as the boundary of knowledge, not the critique of pure reason where you're seeking for transcendental norms that instantiate knowledge and that bound epistemic authority because they limit it in terms of abstract conditions. No, it's within the context of history and contingency itself. I do believe I see that going on. A couple more, spiritual versus religious. Now, this has been a kind of a funny and weird one because, a lot of people say, yeah, the New Age and The spirituality stuff, that's for the birds. There are more scholarly ways of saying it, but I'm just saying. It's not rooted, it's not grounded, it's not empirical, it's not rich, it's not means tested, it's not a rich tradition that has grounded truth claims. That's what I meant by weird. And that the New Age stuff is coming up with other ways of thinking and being, trying to avoid some of the rules and discipline and the liturgy and the ritual of religion, that you out there free floating like a floating signifier. Well, that is one way to look at it, and I'm sure there's truth to it. But what's interesting about some of these elements of spiritual versus religion is that it's an institutional expression of certain impulses versus a kind of impulse that would suggest criticism. Not an Archimedean point of objectivity outside of the flow of history, but one, again, that comes within it. But in this case, spirituality may make religion behave right. Right? That's a sermon somebody could preach, you know. But spirituality as a form of cosmic consciousness, not, right? That awareness, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, we're cosmic citizens. So my spiritual connection, my religion, my institution might tell me, hey, gay people, they're problematic, they're wrong. Women, skeptically viewed, especially through the prism of patriarchal authority, whether conscious or not. Spirituality may want to challenge that by saying, well, dang, didn't Jesus say within a certain Christian hierarchy that it all came down to loving the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, soul, love thy neighbor as thyself? Wasn't that it? No asterisks? No conditions? So what is institutionalized at least has to be challenged by new, fresh developments that are unregulated by extant liturgy and ritual. So in that sense, Jay-Z's own refusal to be nailed down to one religion and to say, hey, I want to use religious insight to say a couple things, because he says in his book that religion has been primarily used to separate and control. That's Jay-Z the rapper saying that. Auto da fe. Mid-centuries of the struggle for civilization in the European world. Be hard to argue against them. Constantinian Christianity, be hard to argue against them. About separation and control, divide and conquer. So he says, as I've looked at it, and you know, he doesn't have to be Christopher Hitchens or the hip-hop version of it, though that kind of corrective is interesting. Does Christopher Hitchens have a spirituality, ironically enough? He got a spirit, right? So the spiritual versus the religious is interesting. And finally, it's eclectic versus dogmatic. And this is the problem, you know, people say, see, that's the damn problem with religion. People who just do the cafeteria version, pick here and choose that and get the stuff they want and leave the other stuff behind. As opposed to what? As opposed to people who don't do that? Don't we all do it? I mean, you know, when I used to go to church, they said you make your own Bible. That was the book. Forgive me for being narrow. We could talk about the Quran, the Tao Te Ching. We could talk about the Bhagavad Gita. We might even speak about the art of motorcycle maintenance. Or Superman or Batman, right? Those are religious texts signifying in interesting ways, especially within the dominant drama of patriotism. Right? Look how Captain America got reread recently, right? In the cinematic portrayal. So, in a post 9/11 world. So what's interesting, because you get nostalgic for anachronisms, which are then forced, interspersed, interpolated into contemporary narratives. So what's interesting then is that kind of eclecticism that we war against really is no different than those of us who say we like this stuff over here and this stuff over here, we just ain't gonna deal with. For instance, I was at a conference yesterday speaking on the church and pop culture, especially around hip hop. And a young minister got up and he said, because I had said some stuff about gay and lesbian. He says, he's very nice. He said, sir, you're talking about that gay stuff, and do we all have to accept, gay marriage? And I said, hey, I get it. I mean, it doesn't mean that you're not Christian, I'm Christian, or I'm not Christian, you Christian. I said, although the evidence usually goes that the people, against, gay marriage think the people who advocate it ain't Christian, just ain't right. I said, at the end of the day, when I think about Dr. Hendricks' conception of making the needs of the people sacred, which doesn't mean you sacralize every desire, it means that you begin to understand the way in which the fundamental issues of justice have to do with the expressed needs of people, not their desires to contaminate, control, or distort, but their desires to eat, breathe, and think. So I said, no, I'm not saying, I said, but to me, if I can do some extra biblical analysis, I said, black people need to be the last people in the world trying to talk about anybody getting married. I said, we need our numbers up. So if we got roaches and rats that are somehow related to black people, we should count them too. I mean, in the numbers, right? In a narrow, patriarchal, nuclear family kind of way, or just in the way of even thinking about, right, because that's the logic if we spin it out. I said, now that would be problematic to many people, and I agree with that. But I said, what's interesting is that if we're going to take and be serious about, interpreting all of reality through a narrow biblical lens, I said, ain't no Jerry curls or chicken in fried chicken in the Bible either. Or Cadillacs or Mercedes. I mean, really? And if Jesus was so obsessed with it, why he ain't never mentioned it? So my point is then that dogmatism has been the enemy of the kerygma, of the teaching, the holy, sacred dimensions of interpreting people's lives. So eclectic in that sense doesn't have to mean a kind of cafeteria, smorgasbord, choose what I want, leave the other stuff behind. It's just that the through line is not about a theological expression of a dogmatic tradition. It's about the assertion of the primacy of love as the organizing logic and principle. Jay-Z certainly talks about the organizing principle of love, not without contradiction, because killing and murdering is up in there too. Hustling is central, but Walter McDougall, the University of Pennsylvania professor, said that hustling, right, read his Pulitzer Prize winning work, he said hustling is the central motif of American history. So there's a relationship between Harlem's founding of money, Alexander Hamilton in Harlem, founded American money. So I guess Puffy, or Diddy, excuse me, and Alexander Hamilton got stuff in common. Right? Maybe they're not so opposed. Maybe Alexander Hamilton's duel with Aaron Burr. I mean, what is that about? Rat-a-tat-tat, never hesitate to put a founding father on his back. Thank you. So when we think about eclectic versus dogmatic here, it's about the assertion of the fundamental principles that organize the logic of one's existence. So when I think about Jay-Z and what he opens up, the contradictions and the conflicts as well, the making the suffering of the poor sacred, looking at the geopolitics of urban culture, the urban theodicy that is put forth, I think at least it's worthy of serious acknowledgement, fundamental appreciation, and not total agreement by any means, but at least the possibility that high intelligence has fused with deep compassion to make arguments about the vulnerable. Thank you so very much.
Well, it says on the program that I'm the respondent, but I think it's impossible to respond to such a wonderful speech. But let me, by apology, say that a couple of days ago, a friend of mine in the graduate center said, you know, a white man shouldn't introduced this program today, this set of lectures, and what makes it worse, you're an English white man. And so I apologize for the JZ, but...
No, I love that. I love that. That's great. I'm going to start using that,
But I think perhaps that could be a new hip-hop band.
I love that.
Just one comment there. The Graduate Centre is a very secular institution, and when people find out that I'm the director of the Religion Committee, the conversation always drifts into, is religion rational or irrational? Are religious propositions true or false? And I sort of say, well, that's the wrong kind of question. Religion is probably closer to musicality than other phenomena. And we don't say of musicality, is it true or false or rational or irrational? And I think Professor Dyson's talk was, you know, sort of resonating musicality in many ways. And he mentioned Max Weber a couple of times, so I can't overlook that by saying that Max Weber himself said that he was religiously unmusical. And so the secular, I think, is a kind of lack of musicality. And religious sensibilities, I think, have this strongly ascetic and aesthetic musicality about them. And so it seems to me that popular religion may be a way of articulating this type of sensibility. Professor Dyson also used the word ineffable, which is one of my favorite words, because the counterpart is the effable. And perhaps the musicality makes the ineffable the effable in our lives. So, but without more ado, can I invite people to either comment or ask questions or whatever? And could you use the microphone, because I think we want to record the session as much as possible. So please feel free to either comment or join this discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Dyson. We went to grad school together, but he got his PhD. I feel like I just got my kindergarten degree out of Princeton. But no, thank you. You raised some very important, provocative points. John Rawls always talked about not having any particular religious commitments, and as we know, Eric Gregory at Princeton rediscovered his undergraduate thesis, and we found that he had deep evangelical commitments as a young man before he went off to war, and lost his faith, so to speak. Right. But what's so interesting is we look at his difference principle, and it is directly analogous to love your neighbor as yourself. Mm-hmm. And so I mention that because we see that he's an exemplar of all those who really are in dialogue with your Western ethical tradition is in direct dialogue with Hebrew biblical principles, right? And Jesus sort of, Jay-Z in particular, his discourse is much more Christian, if you will, more consistent with the teachings of Jesus than the church is for this reason, because Jesus he didn't bring any particular doctrines, any orthodoxies. In fact, he said almost nothing about what you should believe. He said I should act and treat people. And his primary concern, other than God, was the poor. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, not because it's, so I can jump and shout and bump my head on the ceiling and vomit on the floor. The Spirit of the Lord's upon me so I can preach good news to the poor. Mm-hmm. So you see the same thing happening with Jay-Z as one who's maybe not fully aware, as maybe Rawls was not fully aware, that they really are in the finest tradition of the basis of our ethical tradition, more so than those who claim religious affiliation, who sit in the position of religious judgment. And I was wondering if you would just tease that out a little bit more, if you would.
Yeah, that's brilliant. If that's kindergarten, I'm afraid of the first grade, brother. And as you know, this is Professor Hendricks' brilliant and insightful work in his new book, Bending Toward Justice, and in his previous book about, the politics of Jesus. I think that you're absolutely right, and to make that argument is sacrilegious to a lot of people. But to live the principles, to embody them, to have internalized them. What's interesting, I think about Rawls. I also think about, I was talking about Rorty a bit, Richard Rorty. Richard Rorty was the grandson of Walter Rauschenbusch, right? The founder of the social gospel. How does that, one generation, then 2 generations later, show up achieving our country? James Baldwin, so a Baldwinian moment through Rortyian philosophical deconstruction. Jay-Z is the grandson of a Pentecostal preacher. So, we could do a whole lot about genes jumping generations and DNA and so on Jay-Z. I love that. I'm going to tell Jay that too. I'm calling you Jay-Z. You not dead. You got led. Okay. That's a great point you're making in terms of the litmus test is not the dogma of the theology. It's not the beliefs and principles. It's the enactment and the behavior, the behaving of a certain kind of belief and tradition. And I think in that sense, you're absolutely right. I mean, when the way you formulated that, there's no question that the ideas and principles throughout his book, Decoded, certainly can be easily subsumed under that kind of rubric. And if you listen at his constant obsession in his music with a God consciousness. Now, it's different. Tupac was conscious, will there be a heaven for a G? Will I make it? Will my boys make it? Searching for black Jesus. I want a God that smokes like I smoke, drinks like I drink. Whoa. That's a radical identification of God with you, not you with God, or vice versa. But to talk about what you're speaking about, when you look throughout the corpus of Jay-Z, when you forced me to think about it, when you listen to the stuff, it is obsessed with what he terms in his book, Decoded, karma. But we would talk about justice. He talks about suffering. He mentioned, he talks about good and evil, fate and destiny, suffering and inequality. He says that explicitly. So you're even more right. You remind me to say what I had even jotted down to talk about, is that he talks about this consciously within his tradition, right? And if you listen to his, Lost One song where he talks about, his nephew got killed in the car he bought for him for graduation, and he said, my faith, I was almost lost just before it got started. He's constantly playing with that. And look at the signifier of being married to Beyonce. Beyonce, straight up Southern bred, traditional, religious, out of Houston, Texas, right? And then, should you be yoked? Remember that stuff about equally yoked? Do you marry somebody you don't believe? What does Beyonce believe? How does that affect what Jay-Z believes? Is Jay-Z a non-believer, right? And if so, then are they unequally yoked, and are they really married? I mean, But the point that you're making, Dr. Hendricks, is so powerful because at the end of the day, something I was saying yesterday is in response to my man with the question about the gay marriage. I said, I think at the end of the day, I'm down with people who call themselves atheists, who yet perform love and believe in humanity and are compassionate toward other people, versus people who say they believe in God and are religious and who are just like out to kill people or destroy them and retroactively abort them, post-birth abortion. And or retroactive abortion. I think that that the point you're making is so powerful. It bears some serious investigation, but I think it's undoubtedly true that he does, in that sense, live up to the prophetic demands without claiming to do so. And remember, the teacher Jesus said that better to say you ain't gonna do it and do it than to say you're doing it and don't do it. And here's a guy who says, I'm not in the vineyard. He says, I know God, I believe in God, let's leave it at that. I don't believe in Christianity and Buddhism and blah, blah, blah in terms of their religious beliefs. But if we look at, doing the do, practicing the practice, and to me, along with Kanye, having a complicated notion of God, cussing and believing in God. A lot of people say, look at these damn rappers. They get up on stage and they thank God after they've smoked weed and murdered people, well, okay, Snoop Dogg. I want to thank the big Dizzle and the Skizzy. But the thing is that I'd rather have a complicated, Professor Sora was talking earlier about, equality and complicated. What was the other juxtaposition? Conscious versus complicated. Because the point is that often when people get converted, they get whack as artists. The devil has all the great beats. I mean, like, dude, go back to your devil days because your Christian or conscious stuff is whack. So why, when you get converted, do you lose rhythm? Conscious beat, just like, woo. So saying that is like, so having Jay-Z is like having God consciousness with the hottest beats. There's a lot more complicated story to that and a lot more contradiction, and I could certainly be jacked up for various elements of that, but I think, Professor Hendricks, you're absolutely right. I would certainly agree with you and make that argument, and I think there's a lot of evidence to support it, too.
Sam, do you want to come to the mic?
Speaking of the devil with the better beats, most of your talk was focused on Jay-Z as content, and I want to ask about Jay-Z as form. Mm-hmm. You said you went to the concert last night at the Verizon Center,
right?
And it made me think of Albert Murray. What happens on Saturday night is not too far off from what happens on Sunday morning.
Right.
And I wanted to ask whether you have any thoughts about that. And also, as an unrelated secondary question, which is, there is a precursor to Jay-Z in terms of hip-hop and God talk, and that's Rakim.
Sure.
But the religious tradition is different, which is a kind of Neo-Farism, 5% stuff.
Right.
And I wonder how much of that kind of creates a certain kind of marketplace for religious discourse in hip-hop, because you have those kinds of infra-politics of what is the actual kind of insurgent religious tradition that you claim.
Right.
Is it that of, to put this in a very dichotomous fashion, Dr. King Christianism, or is it a Malcolm X, not quite, but a kind of, neo-Fardist kind of a thing?
Yeah, no, that's great stuff. That's great stuff, man. The form, Saturday night, Sunday morning, Al Murray, I'm the Americans, then the blues, stomping the blues. When you think about, and him, and trading what fives that he and Ralph Ellison were in, if you look at the letters as well, there's no doubt that there's the study of form, the aesthetic articulation of the ideal bears. This is what I was implying. Well, I said explicitly at the beginning, but also implied throughout, where I didn't paid attention initially to the form in terms of preaching itself. The act of the rhetorical gesture in a certain liturgical context signifies itself. It offers sacred space to certain utterances, which could be absolutely ridiculous and absolutely profane, but in that context are baptized, right? Whereas outside of that context, the same gestures don't signify in the same way. So the form itself, because of the site of the performance, right? Because you look at what Professor Sora did, that was a club Aretha was in, but that was a church, dog. At the end of the day, she's doing the holy dance, right? She is transformed. Right? The sacred, the profane into the sacred in that, Otto sense. And the mysterium tremendum has descended. The mysterium tremendum has been mediated. So the form itself transmuted and transformed a secular space into a sacred moment. And then often, outside of that religious context, the religious forms don't signify the same way. So that in a religious liturgical context, I was quoting C.L. Franklin or somebody else. Think about it. Saturday night, Sunday morning, did they go back and forth? Yeah, because Bobby Blue Bland says that he got his You know, ain't no love in the heart of the city. You know, and if you ever listen to Bobby Blue Bland's catalog, when he goes, he does that hawk, he got that from C.L. Franklin, hanging out on the road, because C.L. and Bobby Blue Bland were partners. Really? Now that's an interesting moment, right? So that the blues and the gospel were hanging together. And Saturday night, Sunday morning, you're absolutely right in terms of the form. But the form itself, right, Bobby Blue Bland spitting and hawking the same thing that CL is doing, makes a world of difference, however, because the interpretive contexts within which the oratorical performance occurs means that site-specific rhetoric is lent a legitimacy liturgically and, in this case, theologically, because of where it occurs. Some would argue, no, although that's true, it's also, not, either or, dichotomous, it's also true that the rhetoric itself has the power, when performed outside those liturgical contexts, to lend sacred obligation to heretofore secular experiences, expressions, and forms. Aretha Franklin in the club gets turned out. But the argument on the flip side was made too, because people were arguing when Thomas Dorsey came up with the gospel. Oh, you were big, you were playing the blues piano with this woman. Now you're bringing that stuff into church. Sister Rosetta Tharpe, you're bringing it into the church. So that now the secular, or as black people tend to say, the circular, right? You say black, you're sacred or circular, right? I always found that elusive, right? Not only the hermeneutical circle, but also the repetition, not only in an African sense, but in some other senses. So it's always fascinating to me to talk about circular. So, but that now these blues beats are being brought into the church. BB and CC Winans, they look tame now. But there was a day when I was, oh my God, you're what? Heaven? You're singing it on the radio? BB and CC, we can't even tell you're talking about Jesus or not, right? So in that sense, media, I know Professor Frederick has a lot more to say about this, media itself is mediating. We forget media mediates. And if it mediates, that means that there is something at one remove from, meta-theoretically and in terms of empirically, right? At one remove from. So it's being mediated. What's being mediated? So Saturday night, Sunday morning also has to do with the fact that we're uncomfortable with the notion that the context itself changes its interpretation, but the content may be damn near the same, right? Because sometimes what is called for is the blues, not the gospel. When your heart has been broken, you may want to sing, woke up this morning with my mind stayed on Jesus, or you might want to sing, if you're going to walk across my lawn, least you could do is take off your shoes. Right? Spirituals are fine. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. But if you're sad, I've been down so long, look up to me. You could throw in some country music too. For hate and anger. If I'd have killed you when I met you, I'd have been out of jail by now. I digress. But the point is, one of my favorite ones, right? One of my favorite ones. But the point is that Saturday night, Sunday morning is so powerful because of the way in which I think, and this is the argument I was trying to make in my little talk, that bifurcation between the sacred and the secular is often fluid. It's not rigid. It can't, even though we make it that way, the reality is that they are often in conversation with one another. And, the point you're making, of course, is that the form itself mediates a certain kind of rhetorical authority that the context lends it and to which it gives legitimacy, but that the rhetoric itself bears some independent associations that no matter where it is expressed or performed has a meaning that to some degree will challenge that static division. Now, the second part you asked me about, what was that? I just want to remember.
The precursor.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point and a great question, implicit in a great point in your question. Yeah, because we know the Neo-Farism, you talk about the 5%ers, the kind of offshoot of a certain kind of Muslim-associated religious tradition. We know that's already, it's the marginal of the marginal, We know that, right? It's the double marginality. And it's the way in which, ironically enough, the religious has never been exhausted by the black church, or the black church has been central, right? It's like when people say, well, there are many other divides besides the white-black dyad. That's so true, especially in California and Texas, and when you think about the bigger world beyond these darn northeast cities. Still, at the same time, the black-white division has been the major artery through which the blood of bigotry has flown throughout the body politic. So that's empirically verifiable. Other things are contingent upon and derivative from. So even though you're absolutely right, we think about Rakim, the God MC, and Jay-Z talks about him in Decoded, standing by the speaker, suddenly I had a fever. Was it me or either summer madness? Because I just can't stand around, so I get closer, and the closer I get, the better it sounds. My mind starts to activate. Rhymes collaborate. Because when I heard the beat, I just had to make something from the top of my head. So I fell into the groove of the wax, and I said, how can I move the crowd? First of all, ain't no mistakes allowed. So what's interesting there is that the pursuit of craft is the articulation of a Neo-Faris 5% aesthetic that, when refracted through the prism of his own artistic pursuits, becomes a way of making transcendent and universal what is seen to be a narrow and particularist phenomena. So that until, and Nas takes off on that kind of same tradition, that almost disinterested vocal tone that suggests reportage and observation. What's interesting is that Rakim did an amazing thing, the same way that Kenny Gamble did with, Philly Soul. This wasn't no Christian man writing about, wake up everybody, no more sleeping in bed. That's a Muslim dude right now. That ain't your local Christian preacher over there. All that great music, and arguably Philly International and soul in the 70s had the whip. I'm from Detroit. It's hard for me to admit that. Okay, we had it in the 60s and some of the 70s. We was killing with the Temptations. We were still killing, But Marvin Gaye with Stevie. Okay, we did have it. But Philly, equally precursor to disco music. Those long, elegant ballads. But look at what Philadelphia soul did in the 70s was phenomenal. And the God consciousness was deep, but it wasn't a traditional Christian narrative and not Christocentric. The Christology was assumed, but the transformation of the, if you will, the Islamic aesthetic and the Islamic ethic, was so powerful that it was able to signify and prove that that Christianity wasn't the only religion that could be made universal, because that's been the prejudice and bias in the West, is that only Christianity can become neutral, because the Huguenots talked about notions of rights, and that as a result of that, it takes Christianity to assert it. Now, Benjamin Franklin said, I don't care what your religion is, as long as you ain't messing up the public square, I'm down with you. And so in that sense, it's more Benjamin Franklin-like than Thomas Jefferson. But even Thomas Jefferson took a knife to the scriptures and said, the first thing to go, all the miracles. Done. If it can't be empirically verified, boom. So that ain't the Bible. That's the Reader's Digest version of the Bible. So my point simply is this, is that yes, that's a very powerful point about the way in which Rakim made universal, which was a particular and specific religious formation, and proved its not inherent, but of course created universality, and showed how it could resonate in the minds of millions of people who never subscribed to his religion or identified the pedigree of his spiritual, spiritual or religious sentiment. So that's a very powerful point you're making. And yeah, I mean, look, you saw the book that's been produced in the last, written 3 years about the history of the 5%ers. You see the articles and the texts that are coming out now that pay attention to that Tribe Called Quest. We look at some of the, if you will, transformative moments of the native tongues kind of experiments, and you begin to see elements of that in popular culture, but certainly without the institutional matrix to support it. So I think both of those points are very, very powerful.
I very much am interested in this kind of Jay-Z as Jehovah, this kind of God-making idea. And one thing that comes a lot to mind is myth-making. Mm-hmm. I've been trying to kind of sort it out in my head, and I have three kind of ideas in which myth-making and hip-hop kind of come together that I was wondering if you can speak on. The one is kind of a sense of myth-making in the direct sense that you're talking about, kind of making yourself as a deity almost, kind of this creation of a backstory, of a creation myth.
Right.
I also kind of am interested in the idea of myth-making in the popular sense, kind of folklore and tropes, and kind of how you see the Tupac and Biggie thing come again, and Jay-Z and Nas, and kind of this idea of those folklore type tropes. And then also in the idea of kind of cultural forgetting and myth-making, kind of myth-making as a way of kind of forgetting and thinking about the crack era. Kanye's crack music comes to mind, where it's like, let's recreate the mythology of the crack era as something that gave us today's hip-hop. So I was wondering if you can talk about myth-making in those sense, because it's something I'm thinking a lot about in how it kind of stands at the juncture of the popular kind of culture and then hip-hop and aesthetics.
Yeah. No, that's great stuff. I think that the myth-making as deity you spoke about, I think we talked a bit about that. And I talked about the deification of the temporary and the self as the moment of God consciousness and awareness. I spoke about humanocentric theism of William R. Jones and the like. So there's no doubt that that kind of mythology also forces us to see that the stuff against which it is organized and rebels are made to be seen as myths too, right? Because a fourth meaning we could say is that against the religious reality that is established truth, we have these myths. That is, these things that are not true. Because we're not used to knowing that stuff don't have to be literally true, right? Literally real to be true, right? That's why fiction is important. So, and in that sense, you know, that notion of myth operating. But yeah, in terms of that deity, it's very interesting because I think Jay-Z is playing off against that in a very elusive fashion, you know, challenging the narrow concentration of power and attention on those myths. I mean, think about Nas, you know, school Bibles, you know, school text Bibles, Qurans and everything. You know, who made this? He's explicitly challenging it. You know, it's something that's been historically created. I mean, these cats have not been to, you know, seminary and studied with Professor Hendricks and other people, the Bible busters, who challenged the faith. You know, these are guys thinking critically and reflecting, which is pretty impressive when you think about it. They're coming to it on their own, thinking about it in terms of their reading, the trail of their reading, or the challenge to the mythology that a lot of insiders in religion are unwilling to believe. You know, that, hey, you got myths too. Your book of rhymes, the Bible, is full of mythology, full of accreted, the stories around which have accreted, you know, mythologies of power and sex and autonomy, mythologies of autonomy that have to be demystified and deconstructed. In terms of the second one, which leads into the second one, the folklore. And in that sense, that the mythology, the stories we tell to justify and legitimate, you know, the Habermasian moment of communicative praxis as rooted in justificatory language, and trying to figure out how you gonna justify what you're doing, and figuring out retroactively, I believe what I believe, now I'm gonna try to find some stuff to justify how I believe it, right? And the folklore of capitalism, the folklore of you know, righteousness, the folklore of the joining of capitalism and righteousness. This is why, you know, you look at these debates, especially with, you know, evangelical Puritans or evangelical pietists, the new virtuecrats, right? And man, you see a lot of that kind of folklore going on. People just inventing stuff out of whole cloth and just on the spot, you know, just making it up. But alluding to ancient stories and traditions to justify it. So this is where our brother's notion about the form comes in again as well. That because it looks more traditional, and you know, William Bennett is pointing to all these big stories, Plato and all these stories he's exerting. Well, we're inventing new traditions, new scriptures. Jay-Z talks about, you know, scriptures in his own language of scriptures. You know, so that kind of folklore, that mythological assertion, mythopoetics of a kind of self-making in both the anthropological and the theological sense is fascinating in your second point. And then The third one you were talking about, what was that in? You were saying it in cultural forgetting. You said, but see, that's the cultural forgetting in the music and the amnesia. Think about the function of amnesia. No human being can remember everything because you couldn't survive, right? You couldn't exist. Do you remember when you were born? It might have been a very painful experience, right? The humility of amnesia and the compassion of amnesia, but also the willful deletion and distortion of amnesia, right? Ronald Reagan, unavoidably and inevitably, and I'm not even being vicious in referring to his own struggles with memory and the like that he endured later in his life, but Ronald Reagan is a signifier for the willful deletion and denial of certain political practices, which has been repaid by our cultural amnesia about him after his death. Like, dude, I was there. That's not the dude I saw. Like, for real, right? He's the one, now there you go again. Ketchup is a vegetable, he said. He was telling poor people, you got vegetable, eat your ketchup. I mean, Bitburg, Philadelphia, Mississippi. I'm starting my campaign. Implicit versus explicit. I was talking about Jay-Z. He was a master of that. He ain't said nothing. Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, nowhere. But there it is, embedded in the culture. So the point with amnesia is that it's amnesia for those who are related to history in a certain way, but amnesia always masks the knowing of those for whom it is intended. Right? So in other words, the stuff that you don't remember that we have forgotten, the cultural forgetting, as you eloquently reasserted it, always has a relationship to people who know stuff that they don't want to know, right? Or Althusser. Think about Althusser talking about knowing what cannot not be known. What cannot not be known, right? The stuff you can't get rid of, you can't wash your hands of. Pilate's wash basin ain't big enough, right, to wash the blood. Excuse me for that narrow biblical reference, but I am a Baptist preacher. So the amnesia, as Gore Vidal said, we live in the United States of amnesia. There's no question about that. I've often added, and the theme song is provided by Barbara Streisand, written by, who was it, Paul Williams. What's too painful to remember, we simply choose to forget. There it is. Memories like the corners of my mind. Memories? Whose memories? This is why biblical, dangerous memory. Foucault, the insurrection of subjugated knowledge. Knowledges which have been displaced and dislocated. Derridian trace, right? But Derridian trace depends upon the capacity to invoke absence as a metaphor for displaced presence. Right? In Ghana, they say, when you ain't there, I went by your crib. They don't say I went by your crib. They say I met your absence. I mean, So in that sense, I think that there is the cultural forgetting is so powerful, the retelling of the story, the mythology. And it's not just cultural forgetting, it's also amnesia joined to nostalgia. Amnesia joined to nostalgia. I mean, that's part of the thing, too, because you start saying, yeah, back in my day, back when I was a kid. I heard a student in my class, I never will forget this. This is a true story. I heard a student, telling that story because black people passed this from one generation to the other. Back in our day, in the neighborhood, you didn't just get beat by your mama, you got beat by the next door neighbor if you messed up and did stuff. And this kid was like 18 years old. I'm like, dude, it did not happen, literally, because you're the generation where it was supposed to already disappear. But the transmission of the story, the form, had mediated a moral content that was more important than the truth of the story, right? Or the reality of the story. It wasn't real, but the truth he was trying to communicate was that there's a breakage, right? Althusser talks about an epistemic break, a rupture, an epistemic rupture of knowledge. But that knowledge is what I was trying to talk about, embedded. So amnesia is really the loss of embodied knowledge because it's no longer located in a specific matrix, a nexus of history and memory. So, yeah, there's no question that in the music that happens too. You see the profound nostalgia in the music already. I mean, you see it in the golden age of hip hop and going back in the day when I was just a little, I'm not a kid anymore, right? I missed that abide. When I was a nigga around. Okay, but that's a great song. The nostalgia factory is huge in the culture itself. The baby boomer generation want to see everything Nick at Night. Nick at Night. Even hip hop is on it. Rock the Bells. Not an old school touring. I'm right there. Let me just tell you. I'm right there with it. I'm with the nostalgia. But the problem with nostalgia's joining to amnesia is that you begin to think that your kids are somehow, younger people are somehow morally estranged and ethically other than who you are. Now that's the problem. So then you go around talking about what we used to. Wait a minute. Augustus Dill and Du Bois produced a study in 16? Part of the Atlanta Studies? The morals and manners of black leaders? Look, if you read that stuff today, it sounds like they wrote it today. Young people are going to hell in a handbasket. Popular culture is killing them, the Nickelodeon. They're playing pool. Man, we wish our kids were playing pool right now. We wish that's what we're doing. But wait a minute. They sounded just the same. But check this out. You hear people tell it now. Hey, we ain't like our grandparents. Dude, that's who Augustus Dill and Du Bois were talking about. Your grandparents were going to hell in a handbasket. Because each generation raises, it's the Hegelian problem. The Prussian state finds its apotheosis, right? The history finds its apotheosis in the Prussian state. Oh, that happens to be the one Hegel was in. Oh, geez, American exceptionalism. Geez, here it is. Happens to be our state. My school, my tribe, my race, my gender, my city, my music. Back in the 70s, the 70s were being shit on by the 50s. You people are horrible. And then Etta James, work with me, Henry. Wrong with, what? Work with me, Annie? Work? That's a sexual, they talking about getting your groove on, your swerve on. So each generation, 1917, Good Housekeeping magazine, who put the sin in syncopation? It's a Jesse Jackson moment. Right? Who put the sin in syncopation? They talking about jazz, not hip hop. So now jazz people mad at I argue with it myself, brother, it's the brothel that helped produce that music you now play at Lincoln Center. Maybe in 100 years, maybe we'll be doing the magnum opus of Snoop. Falling back on that ass with the hellified gangster lean, getting funky on the mic like an old batch of collard greens. It's the capital S, oh yes, and fresh and double O-P. D-O-double-G-Y-D-O-double-G-U-C. Maybe it'd be 50 years. Dressed up in tuxedos, doing our thing. It ain't even that far off. So yeah, that nostalgia joined to amnesia is a lethal cocktail. And I think that when it plays out in the music, there are ways in which hip hop tries to preserve itself, because nostalgia is colored memory, colored by a desire to rescue the humanity of one's people from, right? Think about Rosato Renato talks about, what is that? Imperialist nostalgia. Imperial nostalgia. How does that happen? A culture is destroyed by an imperial power. But the imperial power acts like it don't know what happened and sits down to grieve with them. What happened to you? You the one who crapped on me. You destroyed me. Right? We see it in America all the time. We create social structures and political practices that decimate cultures. And then we ask why it happened. Imperialist nostalgia. And that's what happens as well. So there are competing strands of nostalgia, competing forms of forgetfulness. And you see it also happening in minority cultures that try to forget. I don't even want to remember that stuff that happened. Don't even tell me about slavery. Don't even tell me about my mama and them being, part of a movement where they had to clean somebody's house. So what ends up happening? You get imperialist nostalgia, The Help. Now, if you don't tell it, somebody else is going to tell it. Now, it's not like you want to tell it and somebody else can tell it, because we know certain people have power to tell it and certain people ain't. It ain't like we had a lack of stories about what happened, but those ain't sexy. If you want to get the story of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, what do we get? Mississippi burning? We get, not only do we get white brothers and sisters placed at the heart of the culture they were certainly helping with, but dadgummit, black people were agents of their own destiny. Not only do we get Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, told through the prism of William Defoe and Gene Hackman, then we get FBI agents made heroes. Boy, I hope DiCaprio can help us challenge that, and Clint Eastwood, I don't know, with the conservative movement, but we'll see. Hope it doesn't end up being homophobic, because we know that he was Miss Mary in his off hours with his second and third in command and all them, with the gay, which I love, which is beautiful to me. J. Edgar Hoover, that's a recovery of a dangerous memory, even though we rescue it from his homophobic intent. But you up here calling Martin Luther King Jr. a burrhead and a moral reprobate, you got your dress on. That's cool. I'm for the dresses. Because as Bill Maher said, and I'll end by saying this in terms of nostalgia, Bill Maher said, what greater argument do you need for the fact that it's not a choice to be gay than a conservative senator would go into a bathroom and toe touch another guy in the stall, because you just can't help it. But imperialist nostalgia and other forms of nostalgia in conjunction with amnesia wipe all those dangerous memories out. And they also restore, on the positive side, certain memories that people want to preserve, certain ethical traditions. So in hip hop, I think it's been a mixed bag in that sense. If I'm answering, I hope the stuff you asked.
Professor Dyson, you talked a little bit about Habermas just now. And I was just wondering a little bit about the public sphere. And we know that religion and politics are so closely tied, especially in black religion. I mean, you can't, just the way that you look at political candidates have to get black churches behind them. When you look at Dr. King, that was very tied to religion. When you look at the Nation of Islam. So I'm just wondering, in the context of what we've been talking about today and hip hop and black music, how do you think that helps the black community get into the public sphere and to enter public discourse? The
black music itself?
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, too, as all the others have been. Well, it articulates a counterpublic to begin with, right? I mean, because black private spheres were public spheres, right? What was private to the dominant white culture was public to us. They just didn't recognize it. That's why they said, represent. Why hip-hop was obsessed with representation as an articulation of a counter-public sphere. So that when Martin Luther King, let's take something more recent. When Jeremiah Wright said what he said, that was in public, ain't nobody, that wasn't in nobody's house. But white America had no idea. It was like, oh my God, are you kidding me? Is this what you people do when you go to church? Jiminy Christmas, we thought you were talking about Jesus. My Lord, we had no idea. It's public, but it's private, it's marginal, it's distant, and it's invisible. And I don't want to make those interchangeable. But in a Habermasian sense, in terms of the constitutive elements of a public sphere and the communicative practices that sustain it, dadgum, Jeremiah Wright shouldn't have been no surprise to people who had access to that very public articulation, but public within the context of, African American religious discourse and the rhetorical practices associated with those black public cultures. They were still ignored and dismissed and marginalized and inaudible, couldn't be heard. What black music does to the chagrin of those in the civil rights movement, because you can tell from the Jeremiah Wright generation, hey, keep that on the low. Not just I'm not talking about the politics, I'm talking about the personal stuff too. It ain't that the civil rights generation got a whole lot of disagreement with Snoop and them. They just don't want to tell nobody. We don't want to be honest, because they believe when you tell somebody, you reinforce a value. Now, I'll defend the older generation here, right? Because a lot of hip-hoppers go, damn it, y'all are just hypocrites, because we just speaking what you believe. Well, damn it, we know that. That's why we ain't speaking it, because we ashamed. We're victims. Just because we believe it don't mean we should achieve. Just because we do it don't mean it should be justified, right? That could be hypocrisy. It also could be, let me war against the worst forms of my nature and not let them go public so they won't go viral, literally and metaphorically. Now, on the other hand, the beauty of what hip-hoppers do is that they begin to foreground and articulate inaudible moments of the culture that previously were circulated in small agrarian culture. It ain't like they wasn't cussing before. It wasn't like they wasn't saying nigga before. All that stuff was real, but they kept it in tightly contained southern agrarian capital and circulated even party records of Red Fox. They circulated tightly controlled. Now you got nigga on a CD that sells all over the world. So now that articulates a different public sphere, but guess what? It's a public sphere that can't be within the control, if any of them are, of the interpretive pressure of black culture. Because when we do it in white America, at least we exert interpretive pressure. Hey, don't be saying nigga. I don't care how cool you are. That's not cool. Right? And the best white people have internalized the black public sphere and the dialogue and protocol. Don't say nigger. If I want to live tonight, don't say nigger. And the part of the Jay-Z song, jigga my N-word, jigga my N-word, jigga my N-word, right? Jay-Z gives him permission that night. You can say nigga, 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 get it all out. So there's the internalization of the protocol and the etiquette. But the problem is, now when you release a CD all over the world, Japanese brothers and sisters have no idea of the intimate local context. So they go on my nigga having no idea that niggas would be mad at you saying nigga. And that black people and African Americans and other colored peoples would find it offensive because why it's been shorn of its intimate, interpretive, and political context. That's what I meant by interpretive pressure. Because once you release that on a CD and it goes global, now it's out of your hands. It always was out of your hands. The moment you put it on wax, tape, record, it's out. Interpretation is loose, unleashed those hermeneutical possibilities. And the replication, the density of replication is astonishing when it comes to audible culture. Because the shift from optic to audible, to the audible, right? I talked about the Cartesian epistemic authority rooted in the glassy essence because the mind as mirror. Well, now hearing, because hip hop has been so huge, but it's the hearing tethered to the seeing that's been problematic. Public sphere? Black women say, now we travel all over the world. Hip hoppers have made Italian men believe, well, maybe they believed it before, that they could just pinch my ass. I'm overseas. What the hell? They're watching hip hop. Audible and, most important, the optic. So the resurgence of the optic, right? So those public spheres in multiple fashion have been articulated. Ideas that were only circulated, sexual desire, erotic entanglement, and engagement, that goes public. Oh my God, that's embarrassing. The politics of a certain cultural formation that that only black people were previously privy to, that goes public. The internal dialogue and the internal differences. Martin Luther King Jr. used the N-word. Martin Luther King's the night. Andrew Young says that the night before King was killed, he came back because we had no Twitter or email or cell phone, and King didn't know where he was all day because he was trying to fight the injunction of a court that said they couldn't march. King picked up a pillow when he got there and he said, "Little nigga, where you been? Little nigga, where you been?" Now, King didn't go in public. "I want to tell you tonight that these niggas are getting on my mind and my nerves." Now, he might have felt that, but he wasn't going to say that. The way Snoop or Jigga or Kanye or Lauren, even after all my logic and my theory, I add a motherfucker so you ignorant niggas hear me. Conscious rappers. So Red's point, complicated, conscious rappers using nigga, right? I engaged Cornel West on his album. I was telling him years before he started making them albums with Talib and them, I said, nigga is a, well, no, he's better. But then when he started getting conscious rappers on his albums, he was nigga, he had a change of mind. Nigga, please. That's what I was trying to say. Right? Complicated. Mad respect, Jesse Jackson, my man. I said, don't get involved with the anti-nigga movement. Because nigga, you know you believe in nigga. And you're going to say it, it's going to slip up, and you're going to say it one day. And he did. Because words can't be buried. This is the brilliance of what hip-hop has done in terms of the public sphere. How you going to bury a word? The NAACP, older generation, public sphere, control, limit, delimit, bury the word. Then 3 days later, like with Jesus, the word rose again. Nigga, we thought we had buried you. No, I am with you always, even to the end of the earth. That where I am, nigger, thou shalt be too. Wow, I have many niggers and mansions for you. Oh my God. So man, that's how that's how nigger operates. Because nigger is an epistemic assertion and an ontological proposition, besides being a terminological expression. And hip hop has brilliantly understood that. So the public sphere there has been one of, the older black generation made a distinction between public and private in a way that the younger generation, and I'm generalizing here, we know it's more complicated, has failed and refused to do, because they saw them older black people saying the same thing, same word with the B word. You know, they see them preachers up there talking about it. Well, we done seen you what? We've heard you, we grew up, we know what you say, men. Then again, men say, yeah, but I wasn't going to glorify it. So even though I have a horrible habit, no, it's not that you weren't going to glorify it. You didn't want to out yourself. That's both true at the same time. There's a glorification that I think younger generations may not have been attuned to, that once you unleash it and you begin to repeat it and say it and re-articulate it, you're reifying and reinforcing it. You're giving glory and luster and power and seduction and intimacy to a term that should be defamiliarized. Then on the other side, the hypocrisy is that, yeah, but while you got your, you say you don't say the B word and stuff in your music, but yet some of the greatest artists who were poets of the R&B generation beating their women at home. I ain't gonna name no names, kicking their behinds, right? Father knew best, 1940s, 1950s and 60s, and yet the rates of assault upon women and domestic violence were horrible. So those public spheres, to answer your question, are articulated in a very powerful and poignant fashion with interesting, stirring, complicated, and troubling consequences. And it has forced us to renegotiate understandings of private and public and what's appropriate and not. The very use of certain words in public space has broken the barrier, the sound barrier, in ways that older black people would be ashamed to even begin to articulate. I'm listening last night at the concert, multi-generational, racial audience. The use of the N-word right there, but it had functioned in a different way. Because at the same time, Jay-Z is using the N-word and Kanye is talking about the N-word and nigga, they got the picture of the Ku Klux Klan up there for their white audience to see. And they showed it for several seconds, maybe 30. It was stunning. And they showed it and it got closer and closer and closer. It was a kid with his Ku Klux Klan. You ain't got to say nothing. It starts early, it's reinforced, it's socially constructed. You teach your kids hate. And you're learning that at a Jay-Z concert. A guy, I'm teaching the class, a lot of kids are in there and a lot of white kids are in there. Because hip hop has never been given credit for creating Obama the same way that the Cosby Show did or that 24, the series did, right? I mean, give hip hop some credit too for breaking down barriers and making it likely that young white people could believe that a black person with intelligence wouldn't be a threat in a destructive fashion and could help lead. That's mediated through. That's a public spherical Habermasian moment that needs to be expressed. And then finally, Habermas is about de-disciplinizing, about asking questions about the rigid bifurcation of knowledge into discrete spheres. And how you translate that, I think, in terms of the public sphere discourse vis-a-vis hip-hop, is that they're challenging the way in which we've tried to corral morality and to quarantine ethical consideration to certain discrete spheres. That if hip-hop becomes a religion, we didn't even touch on that, for so many people, a religion substitute, it begins to organize the entire realm of some people's existence. But off the top of my head, that's how I would say in terms of the public sphere stuff.
We're sort of at the end of our session, but I don't know, is there a final question that someone has been waiting to ask?
So I wanted to come back to your notion of the God complex versus the complex gods, and how different people have embodied this notion of complex gods. So thinking from Jay-Z as sort of the deity, going back to Rakim as not a Christian form of a god, and then thinking about like Machiavelli and how the symbolism of the Seven-Day Theory, the Don Illuminati, the death, but the embodiment of that death in hip hop, right? Not figurative death, figurative death and not material death.
Right.
Even though
literally that's what happened, right?
But then I also want to think about like Sun Ra, okay, and bring Sun Ra into the picture, because you talked about spirituality and this notion of being like a godlike figure, leading some your flock into some sort of resistance and expressing it in terms of opposition, and talking to people who are the most vulnerable, right? And so how do these different figures who are all men, talk to these vulnerable communities, and how do we like contrast that with the image of the queen, right? The rap queens.
Right. That's a great point, man. It's a great point as well. Yeah, the fetish commodity of Marxism helps us understand the attachment and joined to certain psychoanalytic rigors, helps us understand the way in which consciousness is abridged by certain material forms that, when empirically engaged, have a pronounced impact upon both self-conception, hence Marx speaks about being alienated from one's own work as the mark of the ultimate failure of capital, and then false consciousness, right? Gramscian hegemony deals with it differently because it's the seductive measures that entice people to become complicit in their own demise. But in that fetish theory, I think that what hip hop showed so powerfully is that death can become yet another fetish. That the preoccupation with the limit, right? Not Brian, but Victor Turner. The liminal, right? And the liminal is the warehouse of both predictions of survival and resurgence, and also erosion and death. So when I think about, Tupac, somebody wake me, I'm dreaming. I started as a seed, the semen, swimming upstream, planted in the womb while screaming. On the top was my pop. My mama was hollering, stop, from a single drop. This is what they got? This, me? Not to disrespect my people, but my papa was a loser. Only plan he had, my mama was the fucker and abuser. But even as a seed, I could see his plan for me, stranded on welfare, another broken family. I mean, wow. That's a theodicy. That's a Moynihan in reverse, right? Not the coming matriarchy. It's the poisonous patriarchy, right? But either extreme misses the complicated interstices within which, the interstitial moments within which meaning is often produced or at least located. Metastasizes across the body, politics. So when I think about the religious preoccupation with the limit, the fetish of death that has been so disturbing in so many hip hop moments, but you got to understand that as the backdrop against which to understand the emergence of the God complex and the complex gods. Because we got to take the prerogative, but we got to take the prerogative back. God dang it, either we are victims of this kind of mass theological, this theocide and deicide, right? Because not only the death of God, but the death of the theory that explains God, the rational articulation of faith attached to one's own practice, we got to then step in and substitute. And in that sense, you know, it would seem to be likely to be in the hands of the queen, because males, you know, mama's baby, daddy's maybe. To take Hortense Spillers and flip it into the hip hop realm, so that act of seminality and progenitor, you know, the function of progenitor, yeah, we understand the masculine moment, but the fertility and the fecundity, the womb of possibility and meaning, right, exists outside of the male prerogative. And in terms of what will be done, and that's why men are so interested in controlling the narrative of abortion and conception. And why in some states they're trying to say conception begins down in Mississippi at gestation. It is the attempt to control, since we can't, you know, Tupac said, since men can neither create or make a baby, or they shouldn't tell women what to do with their baby, right? I mean, right? Think of that. So now men want to control that, not just now, but I'm saying this is a moment of emergence. So hip hop certainly reinforces a certain patriarchal prerogative, and is devastatingly complicitous with narratives of control and contamination. Because patriarchy, at the end of the day, if it can't control explicitly, wants to contaminate female identity, right? I mean, it wants to contaminate and pollute it. That's why there's such virility and venom, right? Love my mama, hate my baby mama, right? Vertical and horizontal are really, you know, all this mother love for one's mama, but barely any of it for one's baby mama. So it's very interesting how that occurs. So my point is, with Sun Ra, a non-traditional, you know, a religious assertion, and the flock being led, the esoteric knowledge being distributed by means of the aesthetic, the musical creation and tradition. I don't know if I've seen Sun Ra. Did you see, you know, seen Sun Ra? And the ark, and what that ark means, or George Clinton for that matter. You know, George is the same way, in the diapers. I'm taking it back to birth, right? I'm taking it back. So when you look at Sun Ra, or George Clinton for that matter, or, you know, the Church of John Coltrane, or Jimi Hendrix, what you see then is the or Marvin Gaye, you see the articulation of, the expression of, the engagement with spirituality that is profoundly challenging to dominant modes of expression and traditional articulations, and at the same time reinforcing uncomfortably some of the same old tried and true patriarchal narratives that in other areas of their spiritual lives they undercut, right? They undercut in a lot of other stuff, but you know, it's just like with homophobia. The reason traditional religions, you know, old school religion, black people in churches and others, Catholic Church, they were mad at hip hop for its misogyny, and so, but they weren't mad at the homophobia. They didn't even mention it because they didn't even hear it, because they agree. All of them agree what to do with gay people, right? They agree with that. So they didn't even become a problem for them. Doesn't even come up as an issue. Doesn't even register. So in that sense, the parallel would be that, yeah, despite the enormously interesting subversive moments of you know, Sun Ra, George Clinton, and the like, the fetish of death, the fetish of the death of the female, not just the homophobia, as I tried to argue in my book on Tupac, the femophobia, the fear of the female, the presence not only of estrogen literally, but metaphorically, challenges a testosterone-centered politics. And so I think that yeah, there's tremendous possibility, however, in taking the sense of play. You know, all these French philosophers talking about jouissance and all that stuff. Yeah, we was doing that too. You know, we was doing that back at the crib before jouissance or différance were going down, right? Postmodernity, fragmentation, marginality, pastiche. Dude, postmodernity as a periodization and postmodernity as a content-driven, function within the context of modernities. Postmodernity may turn out to be modernity in drag. We'll see. So the point is that in that sense, yeah, some of the old stuff gets smuggled in, doesn't get challenged, and that's why I think the relentless reinterpretation and interrogation is why community is so critical. Old school churches say the reason you come to church is because you might be messed up in your faith, but somebody else can help you out. You might be down in your spirit, thinking your life is over, but somebody else comes along to help you understand that. There's something to be said for community and temple and church and synagogue and formal religious institutionalization. And there's something to be said for the communities that are constituted in these musical traditions. Because people argue vigorously. I mean, they're like, no, he ain't the greatest. No, she's the greatest. No. This is what they meant. I mean, just look at the intense investment. We ministers wish they could get people to talk. No, that's not what the minister meant. Let me tell you what the minister meant in that third line on that last part when the peroration was occurring. Wow, we love that kind of intense investigation. So in that sense, I think that it all points back, the Sun Ra, all that, to a non-traditional religious element that is subversive, that challenges the hegemony of a certain constricted sphere of religious sentiment and passion. But unfortunately, at the same time, some of the ugliness gets smuggled in, and we have to constantly revise it in order to assert its legitimate relationship to the people who find it most useful.
I think we have to thank Dr. Dyson profoundly. I don't think popular religion will ever be the same again, and nor will JZ. So,
JZ, I love that. JZ, I love that.